In this morning session, we presented most of the work that we are doing. What we wanted now, with a very short statement, let's say, of participation, is to highlight which of those areas of work are directly targeting into the creation of neighborhoods that are more inclusive and the reduction of spatial inequality. So the flagship program of the United Nations UN Habitat, what we are working, and this is something that has resonated a lot with the AAA and with our other partners, is that we work on creating a collaboration between different stakeholders on the specific issue of the reduction of spatial inequality. We do it through one tool that we as urban planners, economists, architects, lawyers in UN Habitat, we use for targeted urban with transformation, which is the urban regeneration processes, and how those have the possibility to impact communities and to produce a transformation from the social and also from the environmental perspective, also in relation to climate change and climate change vulnerability. We can move to the next slide. Yeah, so the main aim that we have through this program and what we are targeting is working on creating that awareness for private sector, for governments, for communities on how there is a possibility to create social value while we are transforming these neighborhoods. And also to look into the legal and institutional frameworks on how this transformation, this social transformation can be measured and can be done at the neighborhood level. And as a result from this engagement, we are aiming at transforming the quality of life of the stakeholders, of the communities, and of the different groups that work there. I think with this one, we can skip. We presented this morning already, which is about the value proposition of the program, so what we're going to do. But the main component or the main message that we want to bring today is that this social transformation of our communities that are going to become more inclusive with the physical, with the socioeconomic programs, projects, initiatives that we are promoting, needs to happen in a very integrated way. So we need to work at the same time with the government, with the private sector and the investors, with the community groups and with the academia. And this is the reason why this type of forum, this type of events makes it really interesting for us to understand the different objectives, the different messages from these groups, the different groups that are part of those communities and which are the priorities that they want to see reflected in the transformation of a neighborhood, of an urban area, and how we work with them to achieve a common goal, a common negotiated goal. We presented our framework for work, what we think the way to achieve neighborhoods and communities that are more sustainable, that are more inclusive, in which where the poverty and where the spatial equality is transformed, is by these three blocks of work. These are the three areas that we are working with our different partners on the data, understanding how these neighborhoods are set, how do they work, understanding or creating the methodologies, the specific step-by-step processes on how those transformations need to happen, and also understanding success stories. So examples that have worked in the different regions to achieve these multi-generational neighborhoods, these inclusive neighborhoods that promote the vibrancy because they are inclusive and because different people from different ways of life can find jobs, opportunities, services, transport to get to the place, etc., and a home, of course. And then the other parts that we focus on is the creation of this network, specific network for sustainable neighborhoods, for neighborhoods that are inclusive, and the part three, which are the specific solutions in projects, in interventions, in supporting municipalities to fundraise and to develop these interventions with the community. Next one, and I finish. I see the time is running out. So we produce content on knowledge, on different documents that help us work with urban regeneration. The next one talks about the networks and the examples of partners and events that we are organizing that align with the event that we are here today attending. And the next one that talks about the different partners, this networking effort to see how those neighborhoods, what do they need? Which are the baselines and which are the indicators, which are the principles, which is the departing point. And from those principles, in collaboration with partners such as the AAA, to deduct from there the specific indicators, guidelines, and later on standards, trying to influence also from our side or to bring to the conversation some specific aspect of those standards. I leave it here because I see that I'm 1 minute over the time and I want to be respectful. Thank you very much.
Just by way of background, I'm an urban planner and urban designer, and I've worked in development and regen for 18 years now, and also within academia, local government, and also the private and now the not-for-profit sector, but always focused on placemaking. So just to kind of share that, and that kind of gives you a little bit of a background to some of the things I'm going to share. So I don't think that, I think when I see it in the agenda and I saw it, I think it is a statement. I don't see it as a question. I think it is as a given. It is about people first. I think the question is, how do we do that? I don't think we always see that in everything we do. And I'm probably reflecting on some of my days back in planning and city planning and development and regeneration. And we didn't always see or some parts didn't always see the necessity to really have that engagement. And not just consultation or tick box, but a real inclusive consultation process. And I think, we've moved on a lot further. We heard from colleagues right across the talks this morning what they're doing in terms of placemaking and place shaping and engagement. And we're taking very much a people first approach. From a Connected Places Catapult perspective, well, we heard from my colleague Clemence earlier, even to the approach of how we've set up our program. So we have a Homes for Healthy Aging program. And that's kind of, our program was an idea, but in terms of how that idea has been shaped, that was all about engagement. And that's been engagement with location partners. So that's Northern Ireland in there. That's Ulster University, Queen's University, Housing Ireland, Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and then the communities within Northern Ireland. So the people we've seen in those photographs helped us come up with how we would shape our test bed. Because when I say our test bed, really, when I say our, it's their test bed, it's their challenge, and they're being very giving their time to work with us on that. So very much in how we've even shaped the test bed was listening and engaging with the community first and foremost. Then we went to the innovator community to say, this is the local challenge. And hey, this is how we, using our data science technologists in-house, our human-centered design approach, our futurist team, looking at our market analyst team, have brought together that kind of wider package and insights around it. And then we've gone out to the innovator market to bring them together and make that connection. And that's very much what it's been about. It's been about people first approach with the right insights and the right infrastructure and framework, and going to the innovator community. And that's what we're working on at the moment. So yeah, I'm sure I can add more to it as we discuss it, but they're just some insights, and that's currently what we're working on.
Hi, I'm Julia. I've met many of you already, and it's been really brilliant to kind of talk and share our ideas on communities and design. So I'm the Design Innovation Lead on the Healthy Aging Challenge Fund, and I want to just share some of our learnings and some of our findings and some of our kind of things that we've been doing with you all today to give some insights around co-design. And I'm going to talk specifically about my Design for Aging fund, which is a £20 million fund which invests in innovation, business-led innovation that addresses the challenges of aging. So a bit about the Healthy Aging Challenge, just very briefly. Very close to the aims of this group in terms of a lot of our investments are in independent living and communities that encourage aging in an autonomous way in terms of the way that we have choice over the path we take as we age. So I'll talk specifically about the community side. I won't go on to that, that's some of our projects. So Design for Aging, my project is 26 close to market projects. I can see one of them at the back, We Walk at the back, so hi there. This investment is a £20 million investment with a focus on independent living and physical exercise outcomes. And I want to kind of take up what Erin was saying about it's not a case of if we use design, it's how we use design. And that's how the design stage gate, which is the mechanism that we use with this particular fund and this particular portfolio to ensure that we do just that, to make sure that we consult and use broad areas of the community to consult how we work in terms of developing services for communities as they age. So some of the things, so my background is in data-driven innovation and computer science. And one of the problems that we've talked quite widely about today is this thing about the art of the possible. And Timu was talking about it and Natalie was talking about it too, and so was Simone, in terms of because we can measure something, we choose to measure it. Because we can possibly predict something with what we think might be a 90% point of accuracy, we will try to predict that. But what is the actual use of that to a community? How does that engender independent living or encourage independent living or any autonomy in terms of how we choose to live independently? So the design stage gate was born out of this idea of policing this proliferation of data-driven innovation in terms of how can we ensure that we map technology back to user case. So just to kind of construct that metaphor a bit more clearly. So the user case is obviously what people want, what communities expect, what communities might choose for themselves. What technology can often do is drive and diverge away from the user case because something can be done. So going back to that idea that we can train models from rafts and rafts of data, we can draw correlations that might not actually be correlations, but we can assume different things in data that is actually very, very far diverged from user case. And the more often we do it, and the more often we rely on algorithmic intelligence to make choices within community settings, the more possibility there is to build in bias and to diverge away from the real community need. So this is why we have developed the design stage gate. So the design stage gate does that process that Timu earlier was calling harmonisation. I quite like that phrase because that's what needs to be done. So where there's a technological art of the possible, it's about mapping it back onto user choice. So with this fund, we also, in the next door room, we use the phrase, it's not a polite process. Design, co-design, it's not a polite process. And this framework basically interrogates all of our investments, and unless they adhere to these design principles, they will not receive any further funding for the lifetime of their project. So this is not a polite process. It's about making projects stand up and be accountable for the decisions that they make. And so we look at user engagement in terms of different community groups that projects draw around them. So we have a lady here from Age UK. I've been talking to her a lot about Age UK's involvement in some of our projects. We assess each project's ability or proof of their application of people-centered design. So by that, if a user group tells you, well, we want to live in spaces like this, or we want to live with technology that does this for us, but we don't want to be data subjects. We don't want to be experiments where, because things can be measured, they are measured. So we look at all of these different design perspectives in terms of how assets can be used from the community, real community assets, and those assimilated into the design process. So a service is designed closer and closer to a community and closer to a market rather than away from it. So I'm going to talk you through a few examples of where this is being done in a community perspective or a community setting in a really effective way. And I'll mention WeWalk as well here, because WeWalk have a smart cane innovation, and they're working with the RNIB to really understand about safe neighbourhoods and accessible neighbourhoods, to make sure that that intelligence in terms of the way the cane behaves and interacts with the user is actually useful and community-led. So another really good example of co-design is the Accenture and Hafford Housing project. So this is one of our big design projects. And Accenture are working with a housing company in Wales on a Internet of Things solution to make people feel safer within sheltered housing communities and to maintain their independence within that broader sense of community. And the really interesting thing about this project is that there's a real sense of inclusivity in the co-design process. So well, we talked earlier about how often with co-design, it's the same self-motivated, kind of self-invested type of people who step forward to be part of the co-design process. And Accenture have worked really, really hard with Hafford Housing to make sure that the tools by which the co-design process actually iterates are inclusive. So lots of voice-activated service input, lots of easy-read screen input, so that you're broadening the perspective in terms of who is able to contribute to the design process. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Mac, what does putting people first mean to you?
I'm just putting my thing back on. Thank you. So what does it means several things to me. And one of the phrases that you used earlier in, which I should be using all the time, is the importance of evidence and peer review. But the longer I work as an academic, the more skeptical I become of that approach. Because when I also work the other half of my time in the health service in Ireland, what I often find is when people don't want me to do something, when they don't want me to innovate, when they don't want me to focus on putting people first, they'll ask me, what's the evidence base for that, Mac? And there usually isn't one. Because if it's innovative, if it's a new approach, then by definition, there's not an evidence base for it. And so I think sometimes putting people first is actually going with ideas. I'm not saying throw out the evidence. I would be out of a job. But, you know, the evidence can't be the only thing. And so the idea of putting people first when you're going to people is being open enough and listening to them, challenging some very fundamental things about what you're doing. If you think of the idea that you collect evidence and then you consult with stakeholders, what does that consultation mean if you're not willing to deviate from what the evidence says? If you're saying, I've done a study with several 100,000 people, here's the results. What are your views? Thanks very much. You're wrong. Here's the evidence. Then that's the sort of pointless process. So I think there has to be some accommodation between the idea of evidence being very big scale and very broad, but actually not being contextually significant. And so, very often in academia, we're told that you need a randomized control trial, that you need very large samples, but there's very little evidence, there's very little focus put on what's the context, what are the resources, what are the training of people required that actually produce those sorts of results. So I think going back, as Erin was talking about, the contextual element of it, putting people first is not being a slave to the evidence, it's being informed by the evidence, but it's only part of the picture. If you're putting people first, you have to be willing to try things that go beyond the evidence. One of my favorite phrases, I don't know how many people know this word, is posse-wid. How many people have heard of posse-wid? So it's a systems thinking heuristic, and it basically says, so if you spell it out in your mind, the purpose of a system is what it does, which abbreviates to posse-wid. And the meaning behind it is there's no point, for instance, in the NHS or in our HSE, saying that the purpose of a system is to do something that it repeatedly fails to do. So if you want a system that reduces waiting lists, that has effective triage, et cetera, then you can't keep saying that the way we're doing things now with waiting lists getting longer, the purpose of the system is actually contrary to what's happening. So I think from my point of view, the challenge is often questioning the way in which things are normally done. So, for instance, we have another abbreviation for you, a section in our health service called ICPOP, which is the Integrated Care Program for Older Persons. And there was a huge bottleneck there where they would require, for instance, a consultant geriatrician to assess any new referral. And then ICPOP introduced a model with absolutely no evidence, which was saying, well, there's actually 6 people in the team. Anyone can go and assess someone. We'll do up a form which, requires the major things to be ticked. We look at initial referrals. We'll think, is this most likely an OT problem or a speech and language problem or a medical problem? And what it looks most likely, we'll send that person out. They've done that, they've implemented that. 80% of the time they get it right because they're looking at, from a person-centered perspective, what's the referral, rather than from a system perspective. If there's a referral into the system, you must go through one clinician, which is the bottleneck. So, again, it's coming back to the evidence that you can challenge systems with common sense, and we should always be open to common sense.
And yeah.
I think you've made some really good points there. And I think the evidence point is I think that's a really critical one. And I'm probably going to take that, but use it we've seen a lot on the 15-minute neighborhood concept today. So if I take that evidence, the concept of evidence and people first and that, and data, and there's been great work with the likes of Portland, have done some great heat mapping, so you can see where there's services within a 15-minute neighborhood, and you can see there was a lack of services. So they've done a simple heat mapping, and they've done that just through kind of like isochrones on a GIS mapping system. Brilliant. Visual, people can see it, it's accessible. Melbourne did some really great work at a government or a Melbourne kind of government level about a framework of how they could work with communities. And we've just done a piece of work with the London Borough of Hounslow Council on a 15-minute neighbourhood for Hounslow. So what we were seeing here about some of the ideas around what Professor Morano has done with the the mayor of Paris. Brilliant. The whole idea of how do we look at a walkable city. So it's not, in some ways, it is reinventing the wheel, because this is how cities were developed pre-cars. But where I want to get to with it is, when we did it, one of the things that struck us, and we worked with community groups across Hounslow. So for those that may not be familiar with Hounslow, Heathrow Airport sits within the borough of Hounslow, right? So you can see they've got some really kind of interesting, they've parks, they're right on the cusp into the city as well. But where I'm going to get to this with is, we're talking about how we can empower communities. And one of the things that struck us was, they have no data. They've no data. They've no GIS maps. They can't do the isochrones to look at what the walkable city is. It's held at a local government level. And then the next layer of data is held at a regional government level, or in this instance, it's GLA area. And then it's other institutions. And one of the things we've put into their framework that now the council are looking to do is, how do you start to aggregate data to a neighborhood level to empower them? Because the old adage, what is it? What gets measured gets managed. And the communities are the custodians of their assets, of their trees, of their streams, of their parks, of their places, of their carbon footprint. And if we don't empower people with their data, how can we expect them to make a change? So putting people first is seeing that 100% they are responsible and want to be. But if we don't empower them through data that we're holding at different levels in our systems, we're never going to move it forward. So I just wanted to pick up on that and make that connection.
I think that begins with digital inclusion. It's a very good point. Questions from our audience?
There's a similar mapping exercise being done by one of Julia's colleagues' projects. I think it's called Tribal. Is that the in Shropshire, where they've done that in a rural area, looked at a heat map of services from public data sets. And the whole project set up around plugging those gaps with citizen volunteers. Very nice project. It's one of the big demonstrators. It's worth bearing that in mind as well. I've put a few things in about rural versus city a few times, because I'm from the countryside and got zero intention of ever going to live in a city ever again. So I just like to maintain that balance. There is a countryside as well.
Yeah.
That's my point, not question, sorry.
Very good.
Thank you.
My earlier question around data, I'm off to the Baltics, Estonia tomorrow, where there's been I'm a bit scared because apparently it's kind of on the Russian border, seriously. But I know they've been really innovative in their use of blockchain, for example, which I'm getting more into. And I know there's been some early explorations around healthcare, smart city data. I was involved in an air pollution project about 7 years ago when I first heard the term. I just kind of wondered what people's thoughts were about the practicalities and usefulness of the so-called blockchain in a project like this.
So I think, so blockchain is obviously super exciting, and the potential for encryption, etc., is great. And I think from the user perspective, the exciting bit is to have gates where you can decide who has access to what sorts of data and so on, and also the amount of data. But I do worry that the amount of data, and we have this issue within the Shapes project, like how much data do we bring in to help people make decisions about things? And from how far do we bring that data in? I grew up, I guess as many of you, in a time when we assumed that more data would mean that we knew more. We almost seem to be in a situation where more data means that we're more confused. So in terms of, it's not just data, it's how it's selected as well. So I think, blockchain has, great value, but like any of these things, it's ultimately, it's a mechanism for the information and the usefulness of turning data into information that helps you make real decisions. I think is the key challenge.
But I've been a bit worried. A couple of times people have been saying, quite rightly, leave cars on the edge of the cities, living streets, we're going to walk, like in the old time. But actually, if I'm living in one of these houses and I'm having a washing machine delivered, or I've got some work on the house, please, in our planning, or I suddenly lose my mobility and I need my car, So again, are we going to have electric cars? Are we going to be bus, so again, it's on that practical level. I do hope all our planners are also thinking it's very trendy to put cars on the edges, but I do need sometimes my work. I live in a very narrow street at the moment, and trying to get workmen sometimes saying, where am I going to park if I'm going to deliver something that's heavy?
This lady's question, if that's okay, and I think it's a very fair point that you're making as well, is as we think about place and the role of mobility and transport. And I think it's about, my thoughts on it are, how do we think about it, not necessarily as a car, but how do we think about mobility and needs? So exactly that. How do we look at that services? How do we look at, what we're doing in a lot of cities? I take this gentleman's point here, absolutely on the rurality perspective, but how do we look at last mile logistics? How do we look at, a reduction in car movement? Somebody mentioned earlier about the United States and some of the challenges around obesity. How do we make sure we're not becoming over-dependent? And we have become over-dependent in parts. And we've seen what that's done to our high streets. We've seen our out-of-town retail parks, what it's done to our high streets and how it's started to break down our communities in parts. So I think there's not one answer. There's not a kind of a panacea to this, but I think it's that sense of thinking about how we create neighborhoods and also how we think about the role of mobility within that, and that mobility being active travel. So how do we support walking? How do we create really good routes that people want to move through and enjoy? How do we create safe cycle places where people feel comfortable and safe to cycle as well? And then when we do need mobility or transport, how are we making sure it's accommodated in the right way, but not being the dominant form of transport in it? I think absolutely to that.